everybody, and I hope you're having a great SQL bit so far. My name is Mark Hayes, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my Reboot Your Data Analytics strategy with the Power Platform and Microsoft 365. A quick little bit of background about myself. I've been working with data since 1999, pretty much exclusively on the Microsoft technologies, SQL 7, OLAP Services 7, and all the versions of them since. A lot of work on analysis services, reporting services, integration services, data warehousing projects. And then more recently, of course, Power BI, Power Platform, etc. So today I'm going to talk a lot about that. Most of this session is going to be demonstration based, but I do have a couple of PowerPoint slides to go through as well. So here's my PowerPoint. One little extra thing to note, I do have a companion blog that goes along with this talk. So if you want to dig a little bit more into some of the details, you'll find it up on my website, datasmart.ie. What am I going to talk about? This is based upon my experience of building reporting solutions using Power BI, Power Automate, SharePoint, Office 365, and Teams. As such, the technologies you're going to see in here are Power BI, Power Automate, SharePoint, Office 365, and Teams. If you're expecting to see something else, you're in the wrong session. This is what the session is all going to be about. Before I get into the demonstrations, let's just talk a little bit about data projects. Most data projects that I'm involved with anyway tend to have four key aspects to them. There's part of them that involves getting data out of systems. So in this demonstration, that's all going to be Power Query and get data. There's the modeling aspect, which I'm going to be using Power BI Desktop to do. And modeling is that art of taking data out of source systems and putting it into a shape that actually suits the report in need. There's the visualization side where I'm actually going to be creating reports. Again, desktop and powerbi.com. And then finally, the sharing aspect, when I actually want to put those reports into the hands of end users. Lots and lots of data projects fall into this mode. You can certainly have some projects that don't really have an extract or modeling part. They'll take an advantage of an existing model that exists already, or they're going straight to in a direct query mode to a source system. And yes, that also accounts for a bunch of data projects. I won't really be discussing that in here today. I'm all about the whole get, model, visualize, and share part. For my demo, I just want to set up what I'm going to be demonstrating. So I have a business requirement to come up with here, and it's like a combination of a couple of clients of mine. But one of those clients came along to me and basically said, look, we have budget, company sales, and retail sales, and we want to combine them together. We've got three sources of data. They want to create some reports for their users. If I was to look at those company sales, it's sourced from their company ERP system, their factory sales system, basically. They also have a bunch of retail sales that are sent to them. So this company doesn't sell directly to consumers. They sell into Tesco's and Sainsbury's and likes companies like that who sell to retailers. But they do get retail sales figures sent back to them from those same companies. And these come in Excel files. And then they've got a budget. And the budget is, like many organizations, calculated and stored inside an Excel. So they're the three sources of data. So if I was looking at this, I've split this demonstration into three phases. So phase one is all just about Power BI side, and it's typically where you will start with these projects, especially if it's your first project you're undertaking. You just kind of get Power BI Desktop opened up and get straight in there, okay? So let's have a look at that. We're going to use Power BI, Power Query, to get and combine our data. We're then going to model it in Power BI Desktop. We're going to create some reports and visuals, and then finally we're going to share them in powerbi.com. My architecture will look a little bit like this. Here on the left are my three sources of data: budget, factory sales, and retail sales. I have introduced a fourth source of data, and this actually had to be done for my client because when they wanted to look at the retail sales, the product codes on their retail sales are from the retailers. They're not the same codes that they have inside in their budget and factory sales systems. So we needed a kind of a master data element of in here to actually map retail codes to their own factory codes. So a fourth system comes into existence, and initially this is Excel. On the right hand side over here, we've got Power BI. This is up in the cloud. This is the model, and this service is accessible through your browsers or through your mobile phone. The bit in the middle is the enterprise gateway connector that sits between Power BI and on-premise, and it is what allows Power BI servers to connect to on-premise data sources. So this is kind of the architecture of my first phase of doing this. So let's go straight into a demo and see how we go about building that and what it looks like. So here's my environment. I've got Power BI open already. Let's have a quick look at some of my data sources in here. So I mentioned they get their factory sales from an ERP system. I haven't set up an ERP system in here, but I have got a SQL Server database set up, and there's a couple of tables in particular that I'm going to be interested in here. In addition to that, we have a retail sales, and if I look inside in here, I can see lots of different files have come in from different places. And if I was to open up any one of those, we'll get a quick sense of what's inside in these files, and they're all very, very simple. Just a product code basically and a value going on there. And finally, I also mentioned the budget file. So let's open up the budget file. And the budget file looks a little bit like this, where they got a product code, and then along the top they've got their they have got their layouts for all of the months of the year on the columns. So close that off. I want to discuss that master data element for a second. So we have got a product master table in here, and it is just mapping an internal product code against the codes that appear on the retail sales systems. Okay, so that has to exist as well. So there's my 4 sources of data. If you're starting this from absolute scratch, you're going to have to start bringing in that data. Okay, I'm not going to go through building up the entire solution, but let's give you a flavor of how you go about doing that. You're going to go, okay, well, I need to get data. So let's get data initially from my budget file. So I'm going to go to Excel because I know that's inside in Excel. I'm in here, I can see my budget Excel file, so I'm going to go open that file. After a couple of seconds, you'll get this, and it's looking inside in my Excel file, and I can see in there, here is my budget layout. The reason why you're seeing 2 is one is a data table and the other is just a tab. They're the same thing, and this is just showing both of them. So I'm going to go, great, let's load up my budget table. They always give you a very tempting yellow load button as if that is all you need to do with it. But in my case, and in most cases, we got some element of data transformation that has to happen. So let's click on that. Now, you're seeing a lot of things in here that we ordinarily wouldn't expect to. This is because obviously I've built the solution already. But let's step through what happened when I did do a connection. It created this new thing called a query. So this is my Power Query environment. You can see it called up there. Here are my queries I have. And here's the new one called Budget SQL. And as I look on it, it's got the exact same data as I saw when I opened up that Excel file. Over here on the right-hand side, I see some applied steps. So I can actually replay what actually happened in there. I connected with the data source. These are the objects it saw. I then navigated and picked out a particular object, so it opened it up. There then was an auto promotion of the headers into it, and then there was some data type changing as well. So quite a few things happened there already. Looking at this though, I got a little bit more work to do. I'm not interested in the SKU. I am interested in the stock code, so let's just get rid of the SKU from here. And then my other big challenge in here is I have got lots of values on the columns going across, which I'm not interested in. I don't want those values on columns. I want a row. I want all that data to be put onto rows. So I want to transpose this operation. So let's click all those columns. Okay, then we go to transform. I'm going to unpivot that column. And now straight away, I've done a very significant change to my data shape in here. I've got my dates on rows now, along with the values with that. So now that I'm here, I'll do a little bit of renaming. Let's just call that month. This is budget, so we'll turn around and call that budget. Budget value, and I might change its data type as well to a decimal number. And again, over on the right hand side, you're seeing what I'm in effect doing is building up more steps of my transform in here. If I was to actually look behind the scenes to see what's happening, I can see that by going into Advanced Editor, and I see this, which is the M code behind. This is the language of Power Query that I'm building through a kind of click and drag interface. Now you can code your Power Query directly as well if you wanted to, but most transformations can be done via the click and drag interface. And this is what you get. So looking at my shape now, I've done a bit of work in there now, and from a data modeling point of view, let's assume I'm happy with this at the moment. Okay, you would then go on to repeat that process through all of the other files. You have to connect to your retail sales, connect into your company sales. You want to bring in some dimensional stuff to do with it, and you repeat that over and over. Very much what we've seen. Now I'm not going to repeat all of that in here, but let's look at what I did build to make this work. So I like organizing my models into a fact and dimension structure. So if I look in here are my fact tables that I have. I got one for company sales, that's the shape of company sales. I've got one for retail sales, and I've got one for budget, which is not dissimilar to the budget transform that I did myself there earlier. Up in the dimensional side, I've got some more queries in here. That brings in customer data, this brings in product data, this brings in calendar data. So I'm actually pulling data from quite a few different sources in here, okay, and able to combine it all together. And then I have a reference query, which are basically subqueries of these main queries. Easiest to explain that is looking at invoices. If I go looking at company sales, and I replay back in here, you can see I've got my source. And if I was to read my source in there up here, just to show you the M code, I'm combining something called invoice lines with invoice headers, all right? And these are actually queries over here. So these reference queries, if I go looking at them, I can now replay their steps and go, okay, well, what did I connect to here? Well, actually, I connected to a SQL database, okay? And then I saw all the tables that SQL database, then I navigated to a particular table, and then I removed some columns that I didn't need, and repeated that with invoice lines. So you're using that whole Power Query world to build, to do your ETL basically for you, to get all the data out and to start modeling it and putting it into the shape that you want. When you've got to all that, I'm not going to apply my changes at the moment. We'll just go straight into my model. You'll then exit out of Power Query and you've now got a modeling question. Now I've got my data model already built in here, okay? I can look in here and here's all the tables that exist with it, or I can look at reduce views and here's my company sales view where I've got my company sales query populated here. I've got my other queries populating my dimensions, and I've created relationships between everything. I can look at the same for retail sales, and that I see my product, my calendar, and my customers also related to retail sales. But if I go to budget, on budget, I've just connected product and calendar to it because I don't have actually any customer concept inside my budget. I'm just budgeting purely in there. And as I float over, I get a sense of what is my relationship actually going on between inside in these tables. So that's the modeling aspect going on here, basically creation of relationships between my tables. Tables that can come from different data sources via Power Query. Having done that, you're then in a visualization mode. So going back to my 4 steps, step 1 was all about getting the data. Step 2, which is the modeling, which I've done a light touch in here by creating relationships. Step 3 is creating some visualizations. So I'm going in here, I've got a blank page, and now this is where I should be able to turn around and start putting on some visualizations and say, okay, let's maybe show me how company sales are doing in here at the moment. So that's how much I've sold in there at the moment. I want to see that across some products. So we'll look at this across some brands, or look across this some stock names. I can then resize things, move things around, and start getting to a situation where I start building up a report. Now, I'm not going to build a big sophisticated report in here at all. I'll show you one I've created earlier, which again isn't a super example of a report, but it's just showing you the whole kind of Power BI interactivity that happens between your visualizations when you start clicking on things. Okay. I do want to draw attention to this figure up here, 47K. Later on, this will hopefully increase. Okay, for now, it's still showing that was the latest refresher data that we've done. So I've now got step 1, step 2, and step 3 done. Last step, sharing my data. So I'll be going into File, I'll be going to Publish, publish to Power BI. Yes, I will save my changes. And now this is connected me to my Power BI tenant. And inside in here, I got various different workspaces, and I could turn in here and select my reboot and go select, and that will publish up my workbook. It's already up there, so I'm not going to repeat the publishing at the moment, but that's how I get it to Power BI. I haven't yet shared it with users. And now I'm moving out of my dev environment and I'm going on to Power BI. So I'm in Power BI in here now, and I've gone to my workspace Reboot Your Analytics. And inside in here, I can see various things, content and data sets. If I go looking at my content, I've actually got content up here called Sales V1. So let's click on that. And now here I am. I've got my reports as I've created available up in powerbi.com. And now I can turn around and start sharing those reports with end users, or send them the link, subject to setting up security, obviously, for them. And now the reports are end up in the hands of my end user, and they can get to reports. Super. Let's go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So we've done all this modeling. We showed you a demo of how you build it. Let's do a bit of a critique in here. I have a classic single Power BI solution. Okay, it's like I was asked to do something, I did it. It's effective. It has data. It has reports, but it feels very standalone to me. Okay, it's like an isolated object in a different little website that for a lot of end users in your organization might be, what is this? You know, I've never heard of Power BI. How come I'm going somewhere else to get to my data? It requires some additional data maintenance in the sense of my master data site as well in there. So I kind of want to see if I can improve in this. Okay, make this better. So let's look at phase 2, which is redesign and start leveraging Office. Power BI still plays a massive role in all of this. It's still extract and modeling and visualization, but now I want to introduce something called data flows. So one of the classic problems that I did that you would encounter here is I brought in company sales. Now say you need to create a second model, okay? For some reason they want to, well, you have a new project to do. It needs to use company sales data, but there's some reason why you can't incorporate that into your first model, okay? So now you got the problem of, well, I've already created Power Queries to bring in my company sales. Do I have to now recreate those queries in another model? And if I do, I'm going to essentially have code in two different places. So if it ever transpired that I had to make a change to how I'm handling company sales, I then would have to go back to multiple models to change that code, which isn't a good idea, right? So data flows is a way of sharing data amongst models. It's completely cloud-based. You put it up in the Power BI service itself, and then it just becomes an object in its own right called company sales. And then you can just bring that into multiple models. So we're going to have a look at that. I want to introduce Excel in here from an ad hoc query point of view. Power BI is an ad hoc environment. Users can create their own reports. But sometimes people just want to get really, really close to the data, and the Excel pivot table is a very, very good way of doing that. So I just kind of want to introduce how you could actually start introducing Excel, particularly for your analysts in the organization, and how they can go straight to that data from powerbi.com. And finally, I want to bring in SharePoint and Teams in there as well for two purposes. One, from a data maintenance point of view, because we have master data sitting in an Excel sheet, which I just hate the idea of. So I want to kind of try to protect that somehow and make it a little bit better. So SharePoint will fit in there. And also I can use this then too as a means of getting the data closer to my end users without them having to go to powerbi.com. I can actually put it into an existing SharePoint site or put it into a Teams site for them. If we're to look at the infrastructure of this, so I still got my 3 data sources. I still have got my enterprise gateway connector. Power BI obviously still features in here, but let's look at the new elements. I no longer have my master data sheet that used to exist down here because I've moved that up onto a SharePoint list. The model itself, I'm now actually publishing some of those reports inside a SharePoint page, so they don't have to go to powerbi.com to see them. Analysts can turn around and directly connect their Excel files directly into my model. And finally, I'm also going to use Teams and actually put reports right into Teams for end users as well. And if I go looking of course in here, we still have our web browser approach to getting data as well. So let's demo and see how we get to this. So I want to bring you, first of all, back to Power BI, powerbi.com. Going to go to my workspace and let's talk about those data flows to begin with. So data flows are basically ETL in the cloud. If I go into my data sets and data flows, I can see that there's one in here already called company sales. So let's click on company sales. It brings me to an entity called company sales. I'm going to edit my entity. These entities are basically queries. These are Power Queries. And what happens up here is it opens up Power Query Online. And inside in here, I've got a query called company sales. And as we saw before, we've got steps to our queries and we can replay our steps. If we want to, we can go looking at the M code behind things. But the key thing is we have that exact same data that we were bringing in, except we've just kept it up in the cloud now. Now what's actually happening behind the scenes in here is when you execute that data flow up in the cloud, it will extract its data from its data sources, but it's got to store it somewhere, right? So it's going to store it in Data Lake Gen 2 storage. By default, if you change nothing, it's going to store it in kind of its own Data Lake Gen 2 storage area, but you can configure that to store these files in your own Data Lake Gen 2 storage, which is kind of a useful way of maybe using data flows as a way of actually getting data into your data lake. It then sits up there as a blob object. So now when you're inside in Power BI desktop and you want to pull down the data, you just connect to the data flow, which is connecting to the blob inside in Data Lake, and it's just pulling down the latest data. So it's actually very, very quick from a development point of view that if you have your data already refreshed, you're just pulling it down from blob the whole time. Okay. So this is my data flow. So we're going to connect to that. So and now I'm going to close off my V1 sales in here, and let's look at my V2. So here's my V2. Let's go in and edit my queries. So from a shape point of view, this looks the same to end users, okay? But my queries are different because I'm actually pulling data from a few different places. First of all, let's look at my company sales. So my company sales before used to be put in from two reference queries, one for invoice lines and the other for invoice headers. Those reference queries no longer exist now. And if I look at my query for, if I look at my company sales, it's making a connection to Power BI data flows. So to bring that in without from the start, I'd be going to News Data Source, go more, click on the Power Platform, and inside here I can see Power BI data flows. So I now would do a connect to that, makes my connection. It shows me all the data flows that I have. I can go in here, see I've got one for company sales, expand that, and there's my company sales, and we can go OK, and it will just connect up and pull down the blob object behind, and now I've got my company sales. So from a data sharing point of view and from a code point of view, it's a much better solution because I've just got a small little bit of code to bring in my data, and that's it. If I make a change to my data on my company sales side of things, you've made that change without having to go back to your models to change your data. Let's look at some of the other things in there. So that's data flows. Up here, you might have noticed I've got I want to talk about my products. Okay, so in my first version, I was connecting directly to an Excel sheet to bring in my data. In this version, I want to go to my SharePoint site. So I actually haven't got that open. So let's open that up quickly. So here's a SharePoint site. And inside my SharePoint site and here, I now have a SharePoint list that I can go along and edit and keep safe in a SharePoint world. I can set up security around this so only certain people can change data inside in here. People can't randomly insert in columns. It feels like a much safer place to be keeping my data, right? It's often a list in there now. So this is kind of like a master data management light area for me to go to. Having done that, of course, I've still got to bring it into my model. So if I go looking at it in here in my SharePoint, I've got a new query over here with an SP in front of it, just standing for SharePoint, and here's what I'm bringing in. If I go back replaying on that, I can look at my initial data source and you can see how I'm making a connection to SharePoint. That's the site I'm going to. And then as you see before, it just shows you all of the objects that are available to me as a SharePoint. I've then navigated through it to pick out a particular one, which was that list. I then did a little bit of column renaming, removed the columns I didn't need in here, did a little bit of type changing, did another bit of renaming, and I end up with the exact same shapes I had before when it was coming from Excel, but it's coming from SharePoint. So a couple of little bits of work I'm doing around there. Utilizing my data flows, go into SharePoint. Apart from that, my my end model is the same as we saw before. It's still just company sales, retail sales, and budget connected onto my dimensions. And having done that, I will, of course, publish it up onto Power BI as before. So that's two sides in there. I now want to look at though from a end user point of view and see what I can do in there. So first of all, let's look at that ad hoc element in here. As an end user, I can turn around on that data set and create a report. Okay. So here's all the different, here's my model I was looking at, sales V1. So I can turn around in here and I can go, I'm now on a blank page and they can turn around and kind of go, okay, let's start looking at some data in here. I want to look at retail sales this time, and I want to look at retail sales across my across the brands that are available. And now I'm seeing my 3 brands. Let's do a bit of reshaping, renaming, changing a few things, and say I end up with a report that I'm looking for. And I can turn around and save that off. Okay, and now I've got my SQL Bits demo report available to me. Okay, there it is inside my content, my SQL Bits demo. So that's one way that a user could get ad hoc with the data source. But a second way of doing it is via Excel. So with this report open, I'll click up in here and there's an Analyze in Excel option. So I'm going to click that, get a prompt up here saying create in the Excel file. Oh, and now it's ready to open. If I go down here, open up that Excel file. I'm going to enable editing and enable content. So it's made a connection to powerbi.com to that data model. And here's my data model over here. There's my budget data. Here's my calendar data going on there, company sales, retail sales. So I can now work with this like a pivot table and go, okay, let's look at, maybe I just want a stock list or something like that. So let's get the stock list and the retail price comes out like that. I can go into a little bit of reformatting inside here. So change that to tabular and turn off all the totals. Okay, so now I'm ending up with a report that looks a little bit like this, and I've got an Excel file containing a live connection to my Power BI data model. Analysts generally love this way of working with their data in there. It kind of feels like that they're looking at their data right in their own desktop environment. Well, they are looking at their data in their own desktop environment. So you've brought that data very, very close to them, as opposed to kind of going to powerbi.com to look at stuff to run a separate report, which they might ultimately end up exporting into Excel anyway. So that's another way of getting the data closer to people. And then when we're talking about the actual reports themselves, the Power BI reports, sure, they can go to powerbi.com as we saw, but can we bring it closer? Yes, we can go into, one way of doing it is via SharePoint. So let's go to my SharePoint homepage here that I've created. And you can see there's various reports beginning to render here for me. And here now is that same report sitting inside a SharePoint page with the same interactivity that I've seen before. But in addition to that, I've actually embedded a few more little reports in here as well, which actually are Power BI reports, but coming from different data sources. The first one on the left isn't, it's coming from the same model as here. But these second 2 charts are actually nothing to do with my company or factory sales at all. These actually are looking Twitter, all right? And I'll show you this in a second, where I've been setting up I've been watching the hashtag Brexit on Twitter for the last year and running it through cognitive services to get a kind of sense of the sentiment out there. So that's the average sentiment over all time, and this is the average sentiment based on the last 10 tweets that have happened. So you're combining all of that together into a kind of a dashboard experience for end users. Or you could also do this. We could go into a Teams world, and this is a Teams environment. Here's my team area. So with Teams, you got your normal file upload area. You can put your post, your wiki, lots of other things in there. But in addition, I've introduced in a Power BI report. So I click on Sales V1, and there we go. We've now rendered that report, and we're showing to users in Teams. And as such, they've now got a chat environment that they can start discussing this with other users. There you go. Start tagging people, and they're interacting. So it's the difference of them going to powerbi.com to sitting right inside in their hopefully day-to-day areas of working, which is a very kind of powerful way of getting a closer interaction with your data for end users. So that's working with Teams. Let's flick back to my PowerPoint. So we've done our redesign, showed you a demo, certain key things in here. We've now got the single data source for multiple models, aka company sales. I'm using SharePoint for online data maintenance. We've introduced a SharePoint dashboard for looking at it in there, and also we can use pivot tables as well inside an Excel world, and Teams as well in there to bring it really, really close to end users. So it feels like I've got a more rounded solution in here now, a solution that's using some best practices around data sharing and also bringing it kind of closer to end users, which is all good. But can we improve on it further? There's one or two things I've introduced in here. Phase 3 I'm calling the automation phase. And I want to look at Power Automate in here and see how it can help out. In my solution, there is a little bit of an awkward corner in that the retail sales are received via email once a week. So with my client, if the guy who receives those isn't available or is too busy or is on holidays or out sick or many reasons, the files go nowhere. They're just sitting in his inbox until he detaches them, puts them onto a network share for Power BI to pick up on. So we wanted to see what we could do about that. So we've introduced in Power Automate in here, which will monitor his Office 365 email. When it finds an email from the relevant user, it will detach them, put them onto the network share, and it will also call off a refresh of Power BI, of the model in Power BI. While I'm inside Power Automate in there as well, I figured, look, let's do a little bit of fun with Twitter. So let's demo how we get to this. So I'm bringing you to a website, flow.microsoft.com. It used to be called Flow before they called it Power Automate. And if I look at my flows in here, I've got a few different flows going on. So one in here is called Reboot, Save My Attachment and Refresh. If I click on this, you see the last time this executed was the 29th of August, which was the last time I ran this demo. And if I look over here, actually, there's some interesting things. I got connections going on in here. So it's got 3 different connections. It's got a connection to a file system, a connection to Office 365, and a connection to Power BI. If I go in and edit, and look what's happening here. We have a connector to Office 365 based upon when a new email arrives. So let's look at those parameters behind this. So you can see there's my connection to my account. I'm monitoring the inbox, and let's look at some of the advanced settings, and I'm looking for emails that come from this user, and in the subject they contain reboot. So that's my conditions around my emails. When that happens, I then have an apply to each. So apply to each what? Well, apply to each attachment in that email. And what will it do? It has to create a file. Where does it create a file to? It's got a connection to something called a Reboot Retail Sales. If we go back to that on-premise gateway connector, so far we've been talking about it in a one-way mode for on-premise up into cloud, but the same connector can actually be used for mode for cloud down to on-premise. So Power Automate will use that same gateway to connect on to a file system, a file share on your network. You can also use it to connect to databases and other things on your network as well, but in this case, just to a file share. So when an email arrives, apply to each attachment, save it off to a file share that's accessible via my Enterprise Gateway connector. And then finally, having done that, do a refresh of my data set up in Power BI. And clearly in here, I have another connection to my Power BI. So we're going to run that. We're going to trigger that. So to trigger this, I've got an email over here all ready to go. You can see how it's addressed to myself. I've got reboot and I've got various attachments in there. So let's send that. Great, that's sent. Now, what we're all hoping should happen in here is I'm going to go into my retail sales. So the retail sales at the moment, I do not have a December one inside here. All going well, my flow should kick in and we will receive 2 new files sitting in here. Okay, and there they go, just it happened. There's a December file and here's my other December file. So it looks like my flow has triggered. Let's go back to my flow, refresh, and you can see now how Saturday that has refreshed and that has been successful. We've seen the files arrive onto my network share. So let's actually go to my workspace and see the actual model refresh. Go to my data sets. And if I have a look at my sales V1, you can see that that's done a refresh in there as well. So that's just refreshed. And finally, if I was to go now and go looking at my report, this was 47K. So let's do a repage of my SharePoint. And there we go. We have updated to 51K. While I'm sliding that flow area, let's just look at 1 or 2 other things you can do with flow because it's a very interesting product. So let's have a look at the sentiment in here. So I've got a reboot run sentiment analysis. So you can see how this has been running away all the time. Ran quite recently, and then before that, if I edit this, so I've now got a Twitter connector in here. So the Twitter connector is acting as a trigger in the same way as in my first example, the Office 365 Outlook account was acting as my trigger into my flow. So when those triggers happened, something happens. So in this case, when a tweet is posted and I got a connection to my Twitter account, and I'm looking for hashtag Brexit. So when a tweet is posted that hits on hashtag Brexit, what do? I want it to detect sentiment. So it's making a connection here, it's sending in the tweet text and making a connection up to a cognitive services. I don't know why it gives an invalid connection because it is working away normally. And in the advanced, and that's taking a text and running through cognitive services. And then after that, I then am doing an insert row into an Azure SQL database into my table, reboot Twitter, and I'm putting in the count, tweet, who tweeted, etc. And down there at the bottom, I'm seeing the actual score, which is the score that has come from my sentiment. So that's just giving you a little idea of what else Flow can do. And it's actually got, Flow's quite amazing. It's got about 200 different data sources you can connect to at the moment, all sorts of things. On-premise databases, cloud databases, Google Docs, you can go to Office 365, you can go to Survey Gizmo. There's an awful lot of different areas you can kind of connect into Salesforce. Some of the connectors are premium. Some of them are in the out-of-the-box mode, free to go to, all right? So that's a little bit about Flow and how I'm actually using it to integrate it into my analytics strategy. Okay, so let's go back to my PowerPoint. So it is all about the automation. We saw our new little bit of automation happening down here. Did our demo, achieved automate refresh, did a little bit of fun with sentiment. If I was to look at my solution now, from phase 1 to phase 3, it feels now I've got a much more rounded solution. It's automated, so those files are coming down regularly now, and that whole thing is just happening. If I have a second model, I'm going to be keeping my code safe for company sales and just referencing the data flow, and the data flow has its own little refresh schedule going on there. If I want to get very analytical with my data, yes, I can create a report up in powerbi.com, or I can go to Excel straight to that model and start interacting with it. I can embed this inside my teams, so I'm not asking users to go to a different website to get to their reports. They can just go to Teams or go to SharePoint and see their reports in there. I mean, there are caveats around that if they wanted to go creating their own report, they then have to go back to powerbi.com. So it's not necessarily you would use Teams all the time but it's a case of what's the right fit for the users you have. And for a lot of users, teams with an embedded Power BI report could be the right fit because they might just want to interact with that data. You'll have a couple of slicers, a couple of filters available that they can change the report, but fundamentally it's just that report they want to get to. And for those types of users, it's a nice fit going on there. And overall, it feels like I've got a pretty mature solution in here now. And all of this really has just been showing you parts of the Microsoft Power Platform in there. Okay, so obviously we've seen a lot of the Power BI side of things, and we've shown you the Power Automate in there as well. We haven't discussed apps or virtual agents. They can fit in there as well, but not time to demo inside in here. We've had our data connectors, which we've been going back to, and then how that all integrates in with SharePoint, with Excel, with Office 365, and if you're Microsoft Dynamics users, you find another level of integration happens in there as well between Dynamics and Power BI and Common Data Service in there. So really it's that using that whole environment to give a good analytical solution to your end users. So conclusions. Lots of reporting and analytical needs can be addressed using Power Platform. You don't have to be IT to do a lot. This is kind of a question that will come up. Who do I need to make this work in there? And often it will be almost felt that you don't need an IT developer resource to do this. And to a degree, that is true. But data projects can get complex. You can have some quite complex data modeling going on. You might have some very complex Power Queries. You might need to write some M code as opposed to doing it via the click and drag interface. Maybe concepts like many-to-many start coming in. You might have to get into DAX, which I haven't even shown you at all inside this presentation. So to actually get to a final solution for a data project can actually involve quite a lot of complications, in which case IT, it certainly helps if they're involved in there. So I think from a point of view of trying to get this up and running in organizations, IT have to be behind it from an understanding. Maybe they're doing some of the building, maybe they're building the models, maybe they're building some of the models. You may have business users or analysts who are also trained to build some models themselves, maybe up to a certain level of complexity and then involving IT where necessary. And then you'll have end users who should be comfortable to create their own reports in there. So there's a lot, but it requires a mix of roles inside the organization. You could already own some of this. Okay, now Power BI, fair enough, pretty obvious you're going to need a license. Their general way of approaching is free for your own use. The minute you start sharing, you're going to need a pro license, and they also have premium capacity in there as well. Okay. However, the Office 365, a lot of the organizations would already have an Office 365 account, which as such is actually giving them access to that whole SharePoint side of things and Teams and portals and Power Automate. So some of the nice extra stuff we saw could already be owned by the organization. From a cost point of view, this is generally software as a service cost, so that can get expensive or it can be amazingly cost effective. And I think this is the very interesting thing about Power BI. If we're talking about organizations with hundreds to thousands of users, that's a very different conversation. The basic price point on Power BI is $8.50 per user per month. Okay, so if you have 10 users, then €85 a month to run it. I mean, that's a very, very inexpensive monthly cost to have a very sophisticated solution for them. Clearly, if you had 1,000 users, it's a completely different conversation, but that's then maybe where you start discussing the Power BI premium capacity, as that would offer better value for you in there. Okay, but I really like the fact that the Power Platform enables me to go to smaller organizations. When I say smaller, one of the clients that I kind of base this demo on, they still turn over 15, 20 million a year as an organization, but they'll only ever have half a dozen people who will need to be running these styles of reports. So to be able to offer a solution to those 6 users using Power BI at $8.50 by 6 a month is a completely, it's a transformative conversation over what you'd have had with an on-premise solution to do the same. That's the end of my session, guys. I have a few minutes left. We're all going to be online here, so feel free to fire in any questions and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I hope you found this informative. As I said, I have a blog up on my website if you want to look at a bit more information about it in there as well. But I'm delighted you took the time to come and see my session. Have a great rest of the SQL bits, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.